Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for another webcast in our Civic Education series. This project is a joint venture involving the Congressional Youth Leadership Council, the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress, and the Frey Institute at the University of Central Florida. My name is John Kuhl, and I'm going to be moderating today's conversation with two former members of Congress. We will focus on what happens in Congress following an election. Specifically, we'll explore how a newly elected member of Congress transitions from running for office to being in office. We'll talk about the process of electing congressional leaders and determining committee assignments, and how the White House works with a new Congress, particularly one led by the other party. To help us explore this subject, we will be pleased to be joined by Congresswoman Beverly Byron, a Democrat from Maryland, and Congressman Jack Buechner, a Republican from Missouri. They will field questions from our live studio audience, comprised of high school students who are in Washington, D.C. as part of the National Young Leaders Conference. Before we open the floor to questions, why don't we give our two panelists the chance to quickly introduce themselves. Congresswoman Byron, why don't we start with you?
I'm Bev Byron. I represented Western Maryland, the 6th Congressional District, from 1978 until 1993 for 7 terms.
And I'm Jack Buechner. I represented the 2nd District of Missouri, which was basically West St. Louis County and East St. Charles County. If you ever landed at the airport, you would have been in the northeast part of my district. I served 2 terms. In 1986, I was the only Republican in the nation to defeat an incumbent Democrat for federal office. And in 1990, I lost by 48 votes, which at the time was the closest modern congressional election. I was on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee and the Budget Committee, and I was a deputy whip to Newt Gingrich, who went on to become the Speaker. So,
great. Thank you both. We sort of divided our topic today into 3 parts. The first being, okay, now you ran for office, you're a candidate, now you're a newly elected member of Congress. What do you do now? And so with that, we'll take our first question. Would you tell us your name and where you're from?
Hi, I am Kelly from Sioux City, Iowa. And my question is, what unexpected challenges did you have to overcome in your first term in Congress?
Unexpected? I think today, when you look at all the new members that are coming to Washington as excited, worked extremely hard, succeeded, by and large, in many cases, defeated an incumbent, they're going to come down to earth very quickly. Because I think the air will come out of the balloon a little bit, because the excitement, and as well they should, their families and the people that work for them are on a great high right now. Congress is hard work. It's a lot of late nights, it's a lot of confusing questions, and it's a lot of decisions that have to be made that are not always easy ones.
don't forget that when you start a new job someplace, that very often the person that is vacating the job will act as a mentor for you. You can pick up and call him or her and get some answers. But in most of these instances, the person who is in the seat, you just beat. They're not going to be very hands across the waters with you. That won't be the case. And probably the most amazing thing is you're faced right away with hiring the people that really will make or break your tenure in office, your staff, who can be a tremendous asset or a tremendous blockage. And then the little things like your room assignment. Every 2 years, all the rooms come up for grabs, and based upon seniority, and seniority alone, not your party affiliation, is how you get to pick a room. And so for these new 100 people that are going to be there, that they go in the pool to pick out a seat, and they have to compete with the folks who've already been there. And it's a mad way to do things, and you got to figure out where your district offices are going to be. You're going to have to decide who's going to run your district offices, and then you start campaigning for your committee assignments. And in many cases, the leadership of your party has promised that if you win, that you will get this plum assignment. Of course, they've made that promise to a number of other people. So just the decisions that you have to make in a short period of time, those are the unexpected, because you know you're going to have to make certain things, but you didn't know they were going to be this hard.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Mikkel from Ellensburg, Washington. And my question is, as a freshman member of Congress, are your ideas taken less seriously than those of the members with more seniority?
Is it harder to be heard as a freshman?
It depends. There are certain freshman members that are interested in learning, formulating their opinions, and there are other ones that come with a great deal of cockiness, and they get kind of chopped down fairly quickly. It was interesting when I was first elected, there were 16 women. 4 of them were from Maryland. My first choice for a committee assignment was Armed Services. They had 2 seats down in the front row on the floor. Fortunately, I was on the second tier. Had I been on the first tier, I would have been considered by most people as the secretary, because that was in 1978, that's where most of the women were perceived as being secretary. So you work to establish your friendships, you work within your committee structure, and you work with your own delegation to get some credibility. And then all of a sudden, you've got a really good idea there. We'll work on it.
As a freshman, how did you do it?
Well, I remembered that when I went to college, and I'd been sort of a jock and student government and stuff at my high school. And when I went to college, there were so many options that you had available to you. There was this club and this organization and this sport. And the tendency for a lot of people is to try to do too many things. And the same thing applies when you're a freshman. If you try to do too many things, you will not be successful at probably any one of them. But if you focus, and that's where taking the time to talk to somebody that's been around in your delegation, or that maybe got involved in your campaign when you were running, you can get a lot of advice. You don't have to follow it all, but I think that as a freshman, you can make a lot of your own steps count. On the other hand, if you don't follow any of the advice, you can still be successful, but the odds diminish dramatically. So I think it's pick maybe 1 or 2 things that you're really interested in and hone in on those. And then don't be up all the time speaking. That a lot of people that will be there for their first term will have been speakers of their House, majority leaders of the Senate. They've been the state auditor. So there's people that have got a lot of credentials, but everybody around them has a lot of credentials. So you have to pick and choose what you want to do and when you speak.
One of the things that I think ties in with the first question and your question, and that is, as a freshman member, one of the most key things, other than your committee assignment, is picking your staff. By and large, a lot of the freshman members will come to Washington with their campaign manager and people that have not been in the congressional arena before. It is important, from my view, to make sure that you have a staff that has somebody that understands Washington, understands the makeup of the House. How do the accounting, how does finance work? Who's going to do your books? What is legal and what isn't legal? So those are a couple key appointments as a freshman member that you need to make.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Next question.
My name is Brianna, and I'm from Chicago, Illinois. What was the first piece of legislation that you worked on when you first came to Congress?
Okay, so remembering back, what was the first?
Let's see, that would have been the building of the Golden Gate. No, that was. That's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure what that would be. I do know that something that I worked on was that I had. They were moving spent nuclear rods from Tennessee up to Utah, I think it was, and the train line went through my district in Missouri. And actually, it went like 150, 200 yards behind my house. So we came to find out that almost all of the emergency responders in that area had no training whatsoever in what to do if there was any kind of a nuclear accident. And so I proposed that there be funds set aside for the training of anybody on the route, whether it was a driven route or a train route, for taking nuclear materials from one state to another. The legislation actually didn't go anywhere, but I was able to get the Department of Energy to begin a training program. It wasn't mandatory, but they set it up. So I think that was the first thing. And again, it's like Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. That meant more to my people than a nuclear non-proliferation treaty with Russia.
I think probably in two areas. One, I was on armed services, and so therefore I spent a lot of time looking at military weapon systems. I was like the child in kindergarten that loved show and tell, and the military was very fortunate that gave me the opportunity to ride across the tundra in Texas in a tank with a curmudgeon-y sergeant who said, "Mrs. Byron, what about my health care?" And I'm driving this tank full tilt across the way, and I'm thinking, I better have the right answer or else I'm not going to be told how to stop this sucker. So that was, one area on armed service. I think probably the interior in parks and public lands. I have 6 national parks throughout western Maryland, and ended up with one of the first pieces of legislation that I was working on and was successful was a piece of legislation called Rails to Trails. It's been in being. I don't know whether any of you all have abandoned railroads in your district, but they're now part of the National Trail System. And then followed that along with the American Discovery Trail, which goes from the East Coast to the West Coast, as the Appalachian Trail goes from the north to the south.
Let me go back to something that I think is very important. When I made the mention of former office holders, powerful office holders, chairs, speakers and that, from state legislatures, our mayors, our alderpersons. The thing is that when you come there and you are part of 535 House and Senate members, the expectation is I can be a big cheese and get this done right away. And it's much more complicated when you're at the federal level. And so if your expectations are too high, you're going to be disappointed, that's not a good way to be a participant in anything. And I think that you can get a lot more satisfaction at a state legislative level and a municipal level, because it's smaller numbers of people and it's more hands-on, and you can frankly feel an immediate response to what it is that you've done. And so you've got to temper what you choose to work on with the reality of, well, when's it going to happen, and who do I join into this coalition, and where does my support for it, and the White House and the other side. So I mean, it's a really complicated process, and you have to be realistic about it.
Jack, I think one of the points that should be made is that as a freshman member, you come with an area of expertise from your background. But when you get to Congress, you have to depend upon a lot of staff or friends or other colleagues to give you the expertise. I did not know much about banking, and yet I had a friend of mine who was on the banking. Philosophically, the two of us were in the same lane. And so when we would have banking issues coming up, I would say, "Hey, Doug, what is your position on this? How does this affect the various areas?" So you need to get an expertise, as Jack was saying, in a specific area of your committee assignment, but you also need to make friends with people on other committees, so you know when they have legislation that comes up, you can talk to them about how it's drafted and what kind of an impact it has.
And that transitions perfectly into our next topic, which is, so we have a party change in the House, so there's going to be a new speaker and new committee chairs. How does that process work? We'll go to our first question on that part of the conversation.
I find it interesting we've had all women ask questions.
Yeah, we have.
Hi, I'm Justina. I'm from Long Island, New York. My question is, how are the House and Senate leaders chosen?
Well, that's the same question that you posed to
It
us
is,
there.
yeah.
Okay. They're chosen by their respective political. Well, actually, the Speaker of the House is elected by the entire House. There are names put into nomination, and then there's an election. And I noticed that there's at least, 8 Democrats that ran by pledging that they would not support Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House, which could have created some interesting things had the Democrats
lost.
Yeah. But that's the process. Usually in this case, John Boehner will be nominated. I don't think anybody else will. I don't think there's a Tea Party candidate on the Republican side. And it's interesting, who will the Democrats put up? Will they put up Speaker Pelosi again? It depends on her, I think, or Steny Hoyer.
To be the minority leader.
To be the minority leader, right. And then the vote's taken, and then you pass the gavel back and forth. The Senate's the same way, I think. Yeah, I presume it is.
Congressman, when as a member, when someone's running for Speaker, how do they reach out to members to get support? Or what does that process look like?
It starts very early. It starts before the election. It starts probably last July with individuals that happen to have PACs that want to help people get elected. And then they end up with a question of whether that commitment is solid. A lot of times you'll find somebody that is running for a speaker or minority leader who will promise, my group will push you for such and such a committee. For any freshman members that think they're going to get on appropriations and Ways and Means, it's a very it's a very wrong idea. But sometimes that's used as an issue.
But let me tell you how it trickles down. When I was a freshman member of the 100th Congress, there was actually some sophisticated campaigning to be the president of the freshman class. Now, you don't get paid for that. You don't get any staff for that. It's really a pain in the neck, because if you want to have everybody get together, you got to have pizza or something like that. But it was Buzz Lukens, and I ended up running against him just because I thought he'd been in Congress before, had lost, or no, he'd run for governor and lost, went back to the state Senate, and then 20 years later had run for Congress again. And everybody said, well, he'd been in Congress before. And I said, well, you know, if you were a red shirt, doesn't mean you get to start the next year. So I ran against him, and I lost. And then he ended up with a very ignominious departure from Congress. I won't even go to that. And so my old classmates always say, oh, yeah, you're the guy that lost to Buzz Lukens. You know? So.
You just brought up an interesting point, because when I talked about your friendships within your committee, the friendships that you develop within your state delegation, but there are also some very long friendships that you develop with the people that came to Congress with you. I still see on a regular basis a large number of ones that I came with a very large class of 78 members. Some people like Vic Fazio, Dick Cheney, a couple of other names that are still in the Washington area, Tony Quello, Richard Shelby,
people you bond with,
Phil Graham, and so you bond with these people. You've got a common thread there.
All right. Why don't we take our next question?
Hi, I'm Catherine Newton, and I'm from Jacksonville, Alabama. My question is, what can Republicans expect from the Obama administration and other Democrats in the next election?
Well, you know, last night the president called John Boehner, and I don't think anybody taped it, but I think there was probably an olive branch out there, and Boehner said, I responded and said, you know, we're going to work together. We're in the rhetorical stage now. The Republicans are going to be pretty pumped up because of the largest change in House membership from one party to another since 1948, and probably Beverly and I are the only two people around at that time in this room. But this is really a sea change, and there's going to be a number of people who ran specifically against the president, and the president knows that. I mean, it's not like you said what. They're going to have every campaign ad synthesized so the president can know who was really nasty and who wasn't. But you have to suck it up, and if you want to get something done, the Democrats still control the Senate, and I mean there's some little edges around there with Ben Nelson and Joe Lieberman on certain issues, but then Republicans have Susan Collins and Olympia Snowe that'll move around. So it's not a hard and fast thing, but I think the president is looking towards making sure that in 2012 that he can make the case that either he was successful, or if he wasn't successful, it was because of a do-nothing Congress. I mean, he's not going to be looking at John F. Kennedy. He's not going to be looking at Lyndon Johnson. He's going to be looking at Harry Truman. That's who's going to be the model for the way the next 2 years is run.
You know, the interesting thing is when you talk about the Republican sweep, had the Tea Party run as a third party, we would be looking at, I think, a very different numbers today. I'm amazed that I think it's 34% of the American public today are independents. And during the primary process, those independents had no voice. And so the two Democratic and the Republican parties candidates were the ones that were put before the public for the general election. And the independents voted overwhelmingly in yesterday's election. So when you look at that, and then you look at the question of whether the Republicans are going to have a Tea Party candidate within Congress that's going to take a leadership position. I think you're going to find more so in the Senate than in the House. But it is a fascinating for political junkies, the current situation.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take the next question.
Hi, my name's Janice, and I'm from New York. And my question is, how did the sense of leadership change with a new Congress? And what are the expected changes do you have to face? Does these changes always work out? If not, why?
They don't always work out. People sometimes expect to be able to get a lot more done than they can get done. And therefore they get frustrated sometimes, disappointed sometimes with massive changes. I think when our founding fathers set up the Constitution, they set up with an understanding that it would be moving slowly along. A constitutional amendment is a very difficult thing to get through. And so there's a check and balance system that I think frustrate and will frustrate some of the new members coming in because they think they have a mandate to get everything done immediately. Congress moves slowly.
There is a little unique thing that they do in the House of Representatives, which is called 1 minute. At the beginning of every session, any member can get up and speak for 1 minute on anything they want to talk about. And in the last 20 years, the 1 minutes have become quite partisan and quite vitriolic. I mean, yeah, there's one honoring the marching wombats of, Calvin Coolidge High School in Passamaquoddy, Indiana. All right, that's fine. Or honoring somebody for their 108th birthday. But more and more, they've become real partisan rock-throwing contests. I happen to have, I know it's an exercise in democracy and free speech, but I think that it starts the day off with people being ticked off. It's like that you walk into a classroom and to the person who's sitting across from you, spitting in their face. It's not a good way to start the day. And I frankly think that there needs to be, for these freshmen, that instead of trying to say, I'm really going to just kick the hornet's nest over. I think there needs to be a civility there. And by the way, that's different than bipartisanship. And bipartisanship means that left side, right side, Democrat, Republican, Tea Party, everybody votes for and works on the same piece of legislation. You don't have to make that promise, but I can disagree with you on a philosophy our piece of legislation and still treat you as a lady, as a fellow member of the United States Congress. And I think that's going to be the line of demarcation of how effective this Congress will be, either within itself or working with the president.
To tweak that question just a little bit, so you had Democrats who are the majority, and now they go to the minority. What is it? We hear that it's good to be in the majority. How is it different?
Well, the interesting thing is that when the Republicans took over with the Gingrich, there were Democrats that had never been in the minority. The staff had never worked for a minority member. The committee structure changed dramatically at that point in time. And so when today there are a large number of committee staff people that are out there looking for jobs. And there are certain ones that will work for both parties. And that gives you the continuity. There are some that said, I wouldn't dare work for the other party, and they're gone. And with them goes a corporate memory of trying to put legislation together, how you get it structured for conference.
Well, the most difficult thing to do is to get up in the morning and remember that you were in the minority. I served 16 years in legislature, and even though I was minority leader in the Missouri legislature for 5 years, I never got up one morning and said, today I'm in the majority. I never got to do that. And when you get used to being in the minority, there's some people that literally become sort of working the plantation. I'm just going to do this job, and I get reelected, and if I got a little piece of crumb falls off the appropriation table, it's fine. But it does seriously diminish your enthusiasm for your job. And I think that that the Democrats who are still standing in the House of Representatives will get up tomorrow morning and say, wow, we're not there. We're not the majority anymore. And that means that your creative juices start to shrink up. And I think that it is going to be a very difficult pill. Some of them swallowed it in '94, stayed on with the idea that they'd get it back, and they did. And now that ring has been pulled off of the carousel, and my guess is that you're going to have a number of Democrats who will retire.
Jack, is it better to have it go back and forth, or to be as we saw it for so many years with Democrats in control?
Well, from a political junkie standpoint,
I didn't have a card, and I didn't go to the...
Charlie Cook, who's probably one of the leading prognosticators about elections, said, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, but I love close elections because it makes him, as a seer, more effective, and he can sell his wares easier. But I'll be interested to see what he has to say about this. I don't know whether it's better to go back and forth, but I think it's always wrong to believe that you can't win.
We're just about out of time. Did you want to add anything?
No, I think, having served totally under a Democratic administration, although it was during a Republican presidential administration, and I watched what happened when the House changed hands and the Speaker changed hands, and the difficulty with the staff trying to pull together to get new staffers.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you both, and thank you to our audience today. That, unfortunately, is all the time we have today. Thank you very much for tuning in. I also want to thank our two panelists for sharing their time and expertise with us, Congresswoman Byron and Congressman Buechner. Thank you both very much. Also, thanks to our studio audience from the National Young Leaders Conference for your excellent questions. I hope you found our conversation interesting, particularly given yesterday's election results. That concludes our webcast series for the fall semester. We hope you'll be able to join us again when our program resumes in the spring. Until then, thank you and goodbye.